Platformers are a very special relic in the gaming landscape. Yes, because of how fun and simple they can be, but in how that simplicity can be seen in retrospect. It feels like with every console that passes, some of the industry's most defining games have been of the platformer variety. They sort of act like time capsules with how well they show where the industry was during that specific console generation. I mean, heck, there are a bunch of examples in just Gen 5 alone. Sure, you got your Marios and your Zeldas and your Metal Gears, which were the trio of games that everyone associates with this generation, but that really isn't scratching the surface. This was around the time when 3D hit it big, and more devs than ever before were throwing their hat into the ring to get that slightest bit of attention. There are many platformers of this generation that one could argue in favor of, and many of them I can definitely understand and totally get behind. But in my humble opinion, very few of these mascots managed to stand out in my mind quite like the orange Tasmanian devil ripoff, Crash Bandicoot. Now, Crash came up in the same way as most platform mascots at the time. A relatively no-name studio went on to create a game that rightfully deserved to be among some of the games that defined the 5th generation. But as for why this particular game deserved the spotlight, it all really has to do with how it presented itself. Keep in mind, most 3D games during this time really only had one objective in mind: to wow people, to blow people away with these large sprawling areas, to engross you with these complex and intricate storylines, to blow your mind with these realistic and... But wait, people actually considered these to look realistic? Huh. My point is, these games are trying to push ahead. They're trying to create the same spectacle they'd get out of a blockbuster film or movie, because they were more capable of doing so. That was what the industry was trying to be, and that is the exact thing that Crash was the absolute antithesis of. In contrast to most games on the market, you didn't play Crash to be blown away. Rather, its biggest strength lies within its simplicity, and it's impossible to overstate that that was the thing that gave Crash his own unique hook. Crash isn't about intricacy or depth. Crash is about fun. It was about challenging games that didn't need to sell you on anything else other than being a fun and engaging platformer. And that's the thing that has allowed it to stand out back then, and even nowadays in a modern context. Well, since we're already jumping ahead a little bit, let's talk about that. This has been well documented by this point, but from the early 2000s to about the mid-2010s, Crash has been dealing with abandonment, a lack of focus, and just plain abuse from the various different publishers that he was thrown around to. You can definitely tell it's abuse because at the end of it, he ended up in the clutches of Activision, and if you're in the hands of Activision at all, you're in desperate need of saving. For over 15 years, Crash was seen as just another one of those franchises whose glory days were far past him, and he would share a similar fate of the Klonoas, the Gexes, and the Spyros of the past. He would die a sad and lonely death, destined to be forgotten to time. Or he was. Until June 13th, 2016, where the spark that would end up saving the Bandicoot's life bursted into something 10 times greater.
We're going to bring back the original Crash, Crash 2, and Crash Warped, fully remastered from the ground up for PlayStation 4.
Gosh, even nowadays, that singular sentence still makes me so giddy, as well as millions of Crash fans at the time, which, back in 2016, also included yours truly. This was around the time that I discovered Crash, no doubt thanks to me getting absolutely obsessed with him, thanks to the abundance of critiques, let's plays, and reviews that I ended up watching. And it really speaks volumes that even when the franchise was completely abandoned, the internet, his fans, and his community was still able to keep his name alive. They didn't want to let him die like that. I was incredibly excited for this game, but I could only imagine how much more excited I would be if I was a fan of the series during that dry period. But even still, said dry period would be over, and with the release of Crash Bandicoot, the N Sane Trilogy, Crash would finally be given the spotlight once again. He was back, and he was with a bitter vengeance, and 5 years, a kart racing remaster, and a fully fledged sequel later, it's safe to say they did so in the best possible way. Ladies and gentlemen, nerds and geeks, and all my queer and non-binary peeps, this is the retroactive reverence of Crash Bandicoot. Crash Bandicoot from the jump was extremely unapologetic with how simple of a concept it was. There's a button to jump, a button to attack, and that's it. Those alongside Aku Aku, which is a mask that can grant you an extra hit point, is about as in-depth as the controls and the mechanics get. The levels themselves are incredibly linear and are essentially just hallways containing platforming challenges within them. I mean, heck, now I think about it, that's literally what some levels are. And to give Crash 1 credit right off the bat, I find it very clever how the game uses its environments and aesthetics to contextualize why your movement would be so restrictive. And I love how the game constantly comes up with new scenarios and challenges that have their own unique spin on this linear level structure. It's just really good world building. But man, these aesthetics really come to life in the N Sane version. They did such an amazing job. I mean, granted, it is kind of par for the course when it comes to modern day remasters like these to gain a complete glow up graphically, but I more so just want to shed light on the art style and how each of these characters are portrayed. It's common knowledge that everything about Crash's design, character, and style was heavily inspired by the chaotic wackiness of a Looney Tune character, and nearly every single game in the series went about portraying this concept differently. And everyone has their own preferences and the like, but in my humble opinion, the N Sane Trilogy did the absolute best and is my favorite interpretation of these characters. From a design perspective, everything about them is on point, wouldn't change a thing about any of them. And the same thing can be said for the performances from the new VAs. Again, wouldn't change anything about their direction. But the thing that really glues everything together about their presentation is the animation of everything. Of the Crash games I've played, I don't think I've ever seen a more expressive or wackier version of the character. It's just the way he moves, the way he reacts to the people and situations around him, it all makes Crash seem like an absolute goofball, and he's always managed to make me smile every single time he's on screen. But even the way he moves during gameplay, the effort and stretch within each and every one of his jumps, as well as how good it feels every time I land, all that goes a long way to making the controls feel a lot more natural and more weighted, as well as making platforming a lot more fun. But going back to the levels themselves, as you've no doubt noticed already, every level is filled to the brim with boxes, and breaking these boxes is the real bread and butter of the game. And while it's very simple, and some could argue that it's mindless, for some reason, I find it inherently satisfying to do. It doesn't always have to be the most complicated thing in the world, it just has to be fun. And it's a good thing they are, because if you manage to break all of them, you get rewarded with a gem. That's a pretty neat reward if I do say so myself. Right, Crash? Breaking every box in a level is relatively straightforward. However, not only are there different types of boxes to worry about, but there are some boxes that contain tokens of either Twana, Brio, or Cortex. Upon collecting all three, you'll be transported to this game's bonus rooms. Complete Twana and Brio's bonus room, you'll get an extra life, and if you complete Cortex's bonus room, you'll get a special key. Now, what does this key do? Well, I'm glad you asked, John.
I didn't say anything though.
The keys are used to open up new levels that the game doesn't really tell you about. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but this was my first time 100%ing this game, and I just thought that the keys were just another collectible you had to pick up, and didn't know that they did anything until I went backtracking for the color gems. And hey, look at that! Another thing you have to keep track of. The color gems. Right, so thankfully, before you enter a level, you'll see if the level that you're going in has a colored gem or not. And if it does, that really only means that you get to play the level like normal, breaking all the boxes, doing the usual. However, if you die in these levels at any point, you won't get the gem. The game will literally prevent you from getting it, even if you broke all the boxes. Apparently this was something that was thankfully changed from the original, because in the original, it was like this for every gem in the game. No thank you. Being honest, if they didn't improve the box breaking system, I don't think it would have 100% this game at all. It seriously gets that annoying. But the colored gems is also the point in the game where backtracking comes into play, as a decent amount of these levels have a colored gem path, most of which contain extra boxes. I can see why some wouldn't really enjoy backtracking in a game like this, and it can be pretty deflating to break all the boxes in a really hard level only to find out that the colored gem holds the rest of them, meaning that you essentially wasted your time. But I don't know, I find it really cool that you get to see these parts of a level that you never could before. They can be very weird and nonsensical at points, but that's besides the point. I find that this game still does a good job at making backtracking fun and engaging. So, taking all that into consideration, 100%ing this game can be irritating at best and an obnoxious test of patience at worst. But even still, I think the root of the problem really has to do with the fact that there are just too many things to keep track of. You constantly have to keep track of the box tally, the tokens and the boxes in the bonus room, the keys and the levels that they unlock, the color gems and the paths that they allow you to access. It's just way too much. And not helping at all is how this game is paced, where it just kind of throws long levels and short levels at you with no real rhyme or reason or sense of progression. But for as irritating and teeth-grindingly hard as 100%ing this game can be, I still like it. I still had fun. And admittedly, I don't really know why. I really do think it's because of how well the N Sane Trilogy updates the core experience, from updating the controls to the graphics. All those things go a long way to making this game more fun. And hey, if you do manage to get all the gems, you can skip the final level and the final boss via this very convenient little gem pathway made up of all the gems you've collected. We finally reunite with Twana, who is very seductively waiting for us. Okay. And Crash escapes via that bird, putting an end to Crash 1. Not the canon ending of Crash 1, but still, an ending of Crash 1 all the same. Do I really have to talk about the canon ending? Okay, whatever, it's not even all that interesting anyway. All that happens is that you defeat Cortex, he falls from his blimp, and Crash reunites with Twana as they ride off into the sunset on said blimp. The end, I guess. Okay, move on to Crash 2 now. Finally. Crash 2 is a very acclaimed game in the series, and is largely regarded as the best game of the entire series. But of the many reasons why you could argue that Crash 2 is the best, I think one of the more universally accepted ones is because of how much it adds to the box-breaking formula. For as good as Crash 1 was, it was still very simplistic and bare bones, especially in the era that it was released in. But in contrast, Crash 2 adds some much needed complexity that really makes this formula feel a lot more definitive and realized. There are many instances of this, but one of them can be seen in the plot and how everything begins, because Crash 2 makes it a lot more apparent that the story is going to play a much more active role. Cortex discovers the crystals, a new source of energy. He manipulates Crash and uses him as a vessel to collect all the crystals, and he'll periodically interrupt Crash with either words of advice, words of encouragement, or words of criticism, let's call it.
No, Crash. I said bring me the crystals.
Jeez. Okay, Dad. But in all seriousness, I love Cortex in this game. I found that in the original, he was just more of your generic evil scientist with nothing really to set him apart. But here, he's such a hot-headed maniac, and the things that he says to Crash never ceases to get a giggle out of me. However, thankfully, he isn't the only one who will be interrupting the action, as Nitrous Brio, who formerly worked with Cortex, is now going against him for some unexplained reason, and periodically shows up a few times to direct you towards the gems. But then we also have Coco, Crash's sister, who actually makes her first appearance here, being the more tech-focused of the two. And she shows up to try and find out what Cortex is going to use the crystals for. And spoilers, it's nothing good. I wonder what possibly could have gave that away. The thing that I really find admirable about Crash 2's story is that all three of these characters have entirely different motivations and ambitions. It's surprisingly entertaining to see how these characters bounce off each other and how they tell you to do three completely different things all at the same time. It's not the most in-depth plot ever, but it's definitely a lot more ambitious and takes a lot more strides. Not like that's really saying much, but still. If we're talking aesthetics, then Crash 2 was again a pretty massive upgrade. This time around we're dealing with a warp room, so it isn't really clear as to which part of the island we're on, or if we're even on an island, but because of this, the areas that you travel to are allowed to be a lot more varied, but more importantly, they're allowed to be a lot more distinct from each other. None of the level tropes look or feel alike, and they all have their own unique vibe and energy. And the handful of ones that do return have gotten spruced up beyond belief, and in some cases, the level might share the same theme, but take place in an entirely different area. All that is all really good. But I really quickly want to take some time to shout out the music and how big of an improvement it was from the original, because, oh my god, I didn't talk about the music at all in the first game. And it's not to say that the music was bad or poorly composed, but a lot of the tracks in that first game just didn't do much for me. A lot of the tracks were simply in one ear and out the other. It did a good job with creating ambience and the like, but that was pretty much it. But Crash 2's score, in contrast, is so much more varied and soulful. Not only does every track fit with their respective theme, but the compositions and melodies are so much more memorable and, like the level aesthetics, all carry their own energy and vibe. It's a subtle upgrade, but it's one that makes all the difference. And I mean, at this point, that might as well be this game's tagline, because changes like these are everywhere in this game, the most substantial of which I haven't even touched upon: the level design. For starters, the weird, dated level pacing from the first game is no more. Instead, pretty much every level is of equal length, not too long nor too short. The levels are still very platforming oriented, and box breaking is still the name of the game. But a key difference this time around is that this is where the series starts getting a bit more gimmicky with its gameplay. And I do not say that as a bad thing, because although some of them can take a bit of getting used to, I find that pretty much all of these sections are very easy to adapt to and don't drastically change up the core box breaking gameplay all that much. Also, this is something else that I want to highlight: the has now been replaced by the Crash Dance, which is yet another addition that completely changes the game for the better. Don't ask me how, and don't question perfection, aight? Getting back on topic with the level gimmicks, we have a few of them that returned from last time, mainly the boulder chase and the animal riding levels, with the animal riding levels now featuring Bowler, who controls legions better than the Hog, and even has a nifty little dash move that's pretty much required for one of the secret levels later on. And the boulder chase levels really haven't changed all that much. They really only added a few obstacles, as well as these little mini boosters, which by themselves make these levels so much less stressful. But you can't talk about these segments without bringing up Unbearable in some capacity. Now, I want to show as little of this level as possible, because I don't really want to spoil anything for all those of you who haven't played this game. All I'll say is this though: it features both gimmicks in one level, and it uses them to great effect. and the secrets in this level are absolutely stupid. Well, since we're on the subject of finding things, let's talk about gem hunting, as the gems are still here and are now accompanied by the crystals, which 9 times out of 10 you could just find them out in the open. Now, there are a few quality of life changes to finding the gems, and one of the relatively minor ones is the fact that tokens have been removed. Now, you simply play through the level and break all the boxes without having to worry about keeping track or accidentally spinning away those stupid PNGs with Cortex's mug on them. This also, thankfully, affects the bonus rooms, as since you no longer need tokens to enter a room, you could just now hop on a bonus platform and presto, you're at the bonus room. It's simple, it's intuitive, and a lot less stressful. In general, going for the gems seems to be a lot less of a hassle this time around. However, there are still 2 additions that sort of act like the yin and the yang of Crash 2. One of the best things about the game, and by far one of the worst. Let's start with the good news. As you might have noticed in the warp room, a good chunk of the levels now have more than 1 gem to collect. And that's because the gem count has jumped from 26 all the way up to 42. And while a few of them can be gotten by doing relatively basic tasks, a massive bulk of the hidden gems can be found via secrets. And can I just say, these have to be some of the most obtuse secrets I've ever seen in a game. With how flat out ridiculous these secrets can be, I would totally understand if someone considered these to be unfairly hidden. But the thing is, whenever I think of the genius behind Crash 2 and why it's such a phenomenal sequel, I think of these secrets specifically. Try to keep this in mind. If you ever come across something strange, or if something about the level design sparks your curiosity, chances are there's something waiting for you on the other side, whether that be a gem route or a secret warp room that contains extra levels, which thankfully also gets rid of the keys from last time. However, just when Crash 2 is looking to be a perfectly smooth 100% journey, we also get introduced to the most stressful addition of the formula, the death routes. Yeah, it's sad to say, but the perfect run gems haven't gone anywhere. But thankfully, all you have to worry about is just making it to the route without dying, because once you reach it, you're allowed to die as many times as necessary. Now, for most levels, these death routes, although they are still hard, aren't the worst things in the world, and generally makes for a great way to keep you on your toes. But what about levels like Digging It, or Pissing It Away, or Cold Hard Crash, levels that are extremely long, have multiple gems in them, and more importantly, have death routes that have boxes on them. Under any other circumstance, you would hop on the platform, play the level, and then get the gem. However, because that there are boxes on the route, and because the box counter resets if you die, you're gonna have to break all the boxes on the normal route, and then backtrack to get the boxes on the death route. And if you've played this game before, you know full and well that regardless of if it's in 3D or in 2D, backtracking in these games sucks. In both cases, you cannot properly see what's coming towards you due to the camera, so you pretty much have to tiptoe your way back to the death route, which is especially annoying in Digging It when there's bees that appear off screen. Especially in Cold Hard Crash, where you have to backtrack in the death route itself and have to deal with the most obnoxious ice physics through one of the longest death routes in the entire game. Now, again, most of the levels that have death routes in them don't get nearly as annoying as this, but I'm not kidding when I say that these 3 death routes alone ruined the entire idea for me. I'm sorry, I just can't take it. Man, but really, when thinking about things that I dislike about this game, that's really the only thing that comes to mind. A vast majority of the things that they added only seem to make the game more streamlined, while simultaneously making it a lot more complicated. It manages to nail such a perfect balance between the two, and it's because of that balance why I go back to this game the most out of any game in the entire collection. I love it so much that I blazed through the entirety of it in just under a weekend, no joke. It's a game that I've become very well acclimated with, and a game that I love mostly in its entirety. Come to think of it, the only other thing I dislike about this game, aside from the death routes, is how it all ends. The Crash community has beaten the final fight with Cortex into the dirt multiple times over, and I really don't have anything to add in that regard. However, I just want to mention the fact that I beat Cortex right as he was about to enter his ship, so yeah, just want to flex a little bit there. Now, is this canon? Well, I'm glad you asked, Nick, because it isn't.
I didn't say anything.
If you manage to nab every gem, you'll be contacted by Embryo, who just so happens to have this huge laser blaster that's pointed directly at Cortex's ship. And if you use all the gems you've collected, you will power it, jump on top of it, and then watch as Cortex's ship explodes and falls towards the Earth, putting an end to Crash Bandicoot 2, and opening up to the beginning of the final game in the trilogy, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped. Crash 3 tends to be the fan favorite of the bunch, from what I've gathered, and while many still hold Crash 2 in equally high regard, I always see a lot more people gush about Crash 3 and talk about their memories and nostalgia with it. And in 2017, I could safely count myself among those people, because, well, this was my first Crash game. It's the game that I have the most memories with, the game I'm most biased towards, the game that I was the most excited to see get remade. I have a soft spot for this game, and I still look back on it fondly. However, when replaying this game again for this video, my opinions of it have ever so slightly shifted, just a tad bit. And here's why. Like in Crash 2, the story in this game plays an active role. When Cortex's ship crash landed onto Earth, it awoken Uka Uka, an evil mass who acts as the primary antagonist during the adventure. Uka Uka is also the twin brother of Aku Aku, and like how Aku Aku aged Crash during his journey, Uka Uka does the same thing, but for Cortex. It's a very interesting premise that I feel could have been done a lot more justice, if I'm being honest. I mean, aside from the final boss, Uka Uka doesn't really play a huge role during gameplay, and is instead more so just relegated to yelling at you during cutscenes and the game over screen. Imagine if maybe Uka Uka was floating around during boss encounters, and during the last couple phases of the fight, he attaches himself to the bosses and allows them to do more lethal and more quicker attacks. But I don't know, granted it's not like it's that big of a deal breaker, because in general, these bosses are incredible. I didn't even bother to mention any of them in the previous games, mainly because most of them aren't good. Aside from the final boss in Crash 1 and the tiny and engine fights from Crash 2, none of the bosses were anything that special and were pretty boring if I'm being blunt. But in contrast, these bosses are a lot tougher and 10 times more engaging. They have attacks that could actually throw you off guard, and the spectacle and sheer scale of these encounters goes a much longer way to making these fights more memorable. Making it even better is the fact that once you defeat them, you can score completely new abilities to your base moveset. Now, this is something I actually didn't mention in Crash 2. Crash actually gained a few new moves, like the ability to slide, the ability to crouch, and the ability to painfully slam his entire body on the floor. In Crash 3, a good amount of the abilities you obtain are upgrades to those moves, meaning that Crash can now belly flop quicker, and as opposed to using the slide spin jump, he can now use the famous Death Tornado spin, which can allow Crash to glide through the air, while also increasing how long he can spin for. The additions that are completely new include a double jump, a bazooka that shoots out fruit, and a special pair of sneakers that aren't really much use to us now, so I'll get back to them when they're more relevant. In general, while a few of them can be a bit finicky at certain points, these new abilities altogether are awesome. However, whether you enjoy using them or not, this game makes sure that you get the most out of them because, man, I don't know if it's just me misremembering, but Crash 3 might be the most intense game of the trilogy platforming-wise, or at least a lot more difficult than Crash 2. These levels generally have a lot more obstacles and enemies in your path, a lot more hazards to avoid, and more famously, tons of different vehicles and gimmicks to play around with. Because, like in Crash 2, Crash 3 features levels where you take control of a variety of different vehicles, but the key difference this time around is that they're a lot more prevalent in this game. Unlike last time, where these levels were few and far between, these are parts of the game that either make it or break it for many people, solely because of how often they show up and how many different types of them there are. However, even though there are more of them, I really don't see them as any different as they were in Crash 2. I still find that while a few of them are a bit more jank and control a bit worse than others, all of these sections are still about linear box-breaking action, and are mostly easy to adapt to. Now, there are a few changes to the physics of certain vehicles, most noticeably with the jet ski, but really, that's like the one thing the N.Sane version really alters. I also find that these are the parts of the game that really sell this game's aesthetic the most. Time travel is the main theme that this game is going with, and damn near every level is incredibly varied and different from each other, even more so than Crash 2. Again, being further amplified by the N Sane Trilogy's gorgeous graphics and art direction. And similarly to Crash 1, most of these aesthetics properly contextualize why you'd be in a hallway, which again is really good world building and atmosphere. Once again, the gems and crystals both return from last game. There aren't really any noticeable improvements this time around though, as the bonus and death routes more or less function the same. However, they did add one new collectible that single-handedly makes a relatively straightforward 100%ing journey a whole lot more complicated. Ladies and gentlemen, the Time Trial Relics. When re-entering a level, a clock will appear somewhere near the beginning, and running into it will cause a timer to appear, and you are now tasked with racing through the entire level as fast as you can and breaking the yellow crates that temporarily freeze the clock. Now, this in and of itself is already pretty extreme, but the relics themselves are each separated into 3 tiers: Sapphire, Gold, and Platinum, with Sapphire being the easiest to nab, and Platinum being the ungodly test of endurance that it should be. Just to paint a clearer picture, getting the Platinums or even a few of the Golds requires an absurd amount of patience, trial and error, experimentation, skill, and honestly in a few cases luck in order to even come close. With the Platinums especially, you have to memorize the placement of every enemy, every shortcut, every time crate, every Aku Aku mask, and pull off everything absolutely perfectly in order to get a chance at obtaining them. It's really intense, and a few of these stages were absolute nightmares when played this way. The Arabian levels, where in order to get the gold you have to get a time that's less than a millisecond over a minute, by far drove me the most insane. And don't even get me started on hot freaking cocoa. Getting the gold relic on this stage is absolutely stupid, and it's solely because of the jet ski physics and how slippery and skiddy everything is. And while you're trying to go as fast as possible through nitro crates and the like, it quickly goes from being a test of skill to a test of patience. But even barring those few, the relics aren't the worst things in the world. They're a nice twist to this formula and definitely incentivizes replayability much more than the other two. However, the more I think about it, the reason why I get annoyed by these is the fact that certain tiers of relics are mandatory for 100% completion. Sapphires are the bare minimum requirement for 100%. However, you can increase your percentage to 105 by getting gold on every stage, which means that in order to truly 100% this one, you gotta grind out for those extra relics. And look, while I mostly enjoy the additions of the relics, I think that having them be required for 100% completion is a bit too much. I personally don't think they should really impact your 100% total at all, and instead just be used to open up secret levels, which this game does thankfully do with its sapphires. But even still, when we take all the collectibles into consideration, I'd probably say that Crash 3 is my least favorite game to 100%. It's still objectively better than Crash 1, but nowhere near as smooth or streamlined as Crash 2. And if I'm being honest, I vastly prefer just playing the game like your average Crash game, breaking all the boxes and getting all the gems. When played like that, I'd say that Crash 3 might still be my favorite game of the trilogy, or at least up there with Crash 2, because the platforming is as concise as ever, the new moves are great, the bosses are actually notable, and I generally had fun with most of the vehicle segments. There are still instances of BS, like a few of the alternate exits that lead to even more secret levels, which are just... I mean, come on. But taken as a whole, Crash 3 isn't all that bad, and fortunately, neither is its ending. The final fight with Cortex might honestly be my favorite final boss in the entire series. You still fight against him like normal, but Aku Aku also fights Uka Uka, meaning that there are technically two battles going on at the same time, and it allows for the two different masks to act as additional obstacles on top of Cortex doing his Cortex things. It's a really cool fight, but more or less ends the same way as all the others, with Cortex getting defeated and quickly making a mad dash for the gems that you missed. But if you didn't miss any gems, the Time Twister machine collapses, and Cortex and Tropy get turned into babies and fight over Uka Uka, which is the canon ending, by the way. And with that, the day is seemingly saved once again, ending Crash 3 and the entire trio of some insanely good platformers. Except not really. Alright, so now that we have all the main campaigns out of the way, I want to shed light on the new additions added to the N.Sane version of these games, as a lot of them are pretty massive game changers. For starters, they added the time trial relics into Crash 1 and 2, with Crash 2 also having the addition of the Crash Dash. Given how Crash 2 was closer to Crash 3's style of level design, I think it makes more sense to give him the Crash Dash in that game, but that could only really do so much to change my opinion about the relics because damn, they made sure to make these relics hard in these games, possibly even harder than they were in Crash 3. Just for reference, getting a time under a minute in that game pretty much guaranteed a platinum relic, but here the game spits a sapphire back at you. They are not playing and neither am I. No thank you. As you no doubt saw through the footage I've gathered, yes, Coco is indeed playable across all three games. She plays the exact same as Crash, but comes equipped with her own island animations, her own clear animations, and even her own version of the Crash Dance. But finally, we got the two big new additions being in the form of completely new levels, Stormy Ascent and Future Tense, both of which having their own gems and relics to collect. I'm not too sure on what the general consensus with these levels are. To be honest, I was expecting to lose an additional 4 years off my life due to the amount of times I would die and die over and over again. But I was pleasantly surprised by both of them. For those who are not in the know, Stormy Ascent was a level that was scrapped from the original version of Crash 1. Why? Well, I'm glad you asked, Dahlia.
I didn't say anything.
According to the people who made, designed, programmed, and playtested the level, it was too hard. So, with that knowledge, you might have a better understanding as to why I was so nervous. But to my surprise, while it's still easily the hardest level in all of Crash 1, it was nowhere near as bad as people were making out to be. It manages to test you in so many creative ways, and because of the revamped box system, breaking all the boxes was thankfully very straightforward and simple. And I love how the level constantly keeps you on your toes and forces you to pay very close attention to what you're doing. It perfectly shows the strengths in Crash 1's level design philosophy, and it's a really good note to end the game on. And the same thing can more or less be repeated for Future Tense, the entirely new level made for the ground up for Crash 3. Now, of the two, I'd say that this was the one that was more difficult. The enemies, the obstacles, hell, the box placements can be absolutely ludicrous. And like every other Crash level that wants to make you suffer, there is a death route in this level, and I could say with certainty that this is one of the most maniacal death routes of any Crash game I've ever played. Cold Hard Crash is still worse though. I didn't think platforming in these games could get any more complicated, but the more I think of it, that's actually the thing that I love about this level. It's the only level in Crash 3 that really pushes you to use your abilities as much as you possibly can. I don't think I've ever used or abused the abilities nearly as much as I did in this one level. It's all crafted with them in mind, and as a result, this is easily among one of my favorites in the entire collection. And when you factor in the relics and what they do to this level, I'd go as far to argue that this level's at its peak when you speed through it. It's still very hard and very unforgiving, but I never, not even for a second, got a little bit angry or frustrated, which says a lot to how well the level is designed and how well the abilities are integrated into it. All around, these are two of the best levels in Crash Bandicoot history, and act as neat little additions to games that are already beyond iconic. Playing these games again for this video was an absolute treat. Even with their flaws and annoying design elements, it always seems like those moments were intentionally designed to challenge you rather than being a product of dated or sloppy design. They're games that, to this day, remain so well crafted and enjoyable, and despite all these games being over 20 years old, they still manage to have such a timeless quality to them. But I really want to emphasize that last part, timelessness, because in a sense, these games might just be the most of their time games ever released. Because even though it was a selling point for these games to be about linear action platforming, it was most likely designed that way because during the time when these games came out, there wasn't really a right or wrong way to make a 3D game. I mean, the entire industry was still figuring that part out, and it was years away from actually making any sort of progress. So, as a result, we got games that were incredibly distinct from each other. No one game from this era looked the same, or played the same. They all had their own unique style, their own flair, they added their own unique twists to well-established formulas, and more importantly, they were trying to push the medium forward. But like I said, it took a long time to actually get there, and the unfortunate consequence of all this ambition that so many of these 5th and even early 6th gen games had is that they haven't aged as gracefully when viewed in a modern context. But in comparison to those games, Crash just seemed so much more fine-tuned, so much more refined. It was so much more sure of itself and was just bursting with so much life and energy. It's because of those things that have allowed time to be a lot nicer to these games. And indeed, time was all it took, as evident by this very collection. In 2017, when the N Sane Trilogy dropped, it was met with critical acclaim. And even though it wasn't everybody's cup of tea, that didn't change the fact that younger people like me, who heard of Crash via the internet and thought that it looked cool, could pick up and play one of these games and have an absolute blast. Because for as much as the N Sane Trilogy fixed up and polished these games, it doesn't change the fact that at their core, these games are just as fun to play as they were in the 90s. Timeless is not a word that we'll use lightly, but it's the exact word that I can use to describe these games. They're truly relics of gaming history, some of the best games of their time, and some of the greatest platformers ever made. Some might call it an overstatement, some might say that I'm simply gassing them up, but to me, it still remains all the more true. Also, for those wondering, this is how I would rank them. I know at least one person was going to ask anyway, so here we go. Okay, bye.